To Laci Green. I watched your video series titled How Many Freakin' Genders, Parts 1 and 2, and this is going to be a response to Part 1, because Part 2 seems to be only addressing other feminists, so I kind of feel as though that video is not for me and my kind. So I'm just going to kind of give my thoughts on some of the things that I personally disagree with, because that's where all the dialogue is.
So I hopped on Twitter and asked those of you who do feel that there are only two, why you feel that way.
Well, since I've been perma-banned from Twitter, I might as well give you my opinion here. The reason why is because biological sex and gender are linked. So if there are two biological sexes, there are two genders. That's at least the way I see it.
Feminists and anti-feminists alike, in the course of this conversation, you may very well find yourself disagreeing with some of the things that I'm going to say. And I say, cool, tell me why.
Yeah, I will find myself disagreeing with a lot of what you have to say, but what's the fun in an echo chamber? And we'll get around to me telling you why.
I'm open to other perspectives. I'm open to changing my mind on this stuff. I have before.
Well, if you're open to having your mind changed, in the lottery fucking chance you even see this, let's try and change your mind. And I too am open to having mine changed. I have changed my mind as well on this topic.
But I need strong arguments. I need arguments that are logically sound, that are not based on emotions.
That's a fair list of requirements, but I'm going to go ahead and keep that clip for later. You'll see why.
Arguments that are backed by science and data wherever possible.
Well, I'm afraid that's going to be impossible because you're talking about an argument from semantics, which is philosophy, not science.
And would absolutely get off to responses that address what I actually said.
Haha, yeah, the dreaded straw man fallacy. We're all used to that one, Laci. I hope that what I address is what you actually say, but I might misinterpret some things.
I see three political groups, three basic philosophies.
Yeah, that's probably because this is a discussion about philosophy.
Anti-feminists say there are two, only two. Radical feminists say, well, gender doesn't actually really exist. And liberal feminists say, well, gender is infinite and it's expanding.
Yes, and all of those definitions are valid so long as they're applied consistently. The issue is they're not usually applied consistently, especially in discussion, and they're not very well defined between those different camps. And I understand that's the whole point of this video, but you're not really going to get anybody to change their definition because, once again, it's all just semantics.
How are we all looking at the same thing, at gender, and coming to such wildly different conclusions about it? That's the question, right?
Well, I don't know, Laci. How is it that I can go to Atlanta, Georgia and order a Coke, and then the motherfucker, without even telling me that they only have Pepsi products, brings me a goddamn Pepsi? Fuck you, American South. But anyway, it's mostly to do with just cultural differences or differences in background, differences in outlook. Like I said, they're all valid definitions. They're just used in different contexts and in different modes of discussion.
For starters, I'm not convinced that we are all looking at the same thing. Genitals, specifically.
Well, yeah, I mean, in the first definition you gave, or the anti-feminist definition of gender, it's strictly a function of biology, and in the second definition, biology at least plays a key role. So, yeah, we pretty much are looking at different genitals, because there are essentially two sets.
This is a penis, and this is a vulva. In biology class, or maybe porn.
Yeah, porn.
There are basically two sets of equipment that allow humans to reproduce. That is male and female. XY and XX. That is basically sex. Basically.
Well, Laci, as it states in one of your sources in your video, chromosomal sex determination in mammals, it defines biological sex kind of like this. Unlike the situation in Drosophila, I don't know. It's discussed below, but we're not going to get into that. The mammalian Y chromosome is a crucial factor in determining sex in mammals. A person with 5 X chromosomes and 1 Y chromosome, XXXXXY, would be male. So that really looks at more the presence or absence of a Y chromosome in determining sex. And that is basically sex. Once again, without the situation of Drosophila, whatever it is.
A more comprehensive account of biological sex includes 4 traits. You've got chromosomes, hormones, primary sex characteristics, and secondary sex characteristics.
No, just because it looks at more factors doesn't necessarily make it more comprehensive. It just makes it more convoluted, really. In order for it to be comprehensive, it would have to be more complete, and it's not necessarily, as stated earlier, more complete.
What's notable about sex is that all mammals have one. The vast majority of mammals are either XX or XY.
Why, yes, Laci, that's how evolution works. Animals that are more closely related to us have more similar traits. In this case, how they reproduce.
You know, there are some animals that have traits from both, just like us.
No, Laci, there are no human hermaphrodites. When we refer to certain particular intersex people as hermaphroditic, it doesn't mean they can reproduce at all, because they're always fucking sterile and infertile. They can't reproduce, so no, those people are not like fucking slugs.
There are animals that transition between sexes.
But there are not people who transition between sexes. There are people who adopt mostly secondary sex characteristics of the opposite gender, but we do not transition between sexes. That is something that has never happened in human history.
But what's not just like us, what other animals don't have, in my book, is gender.
What? Animals absolutely have gender, regardless of how you define it. You know, when you define it in the biological sense, then saying that animals have sex and not gender is like saying whales are enormous but not humongous. Under the more APA sort of researcher definition, where they look more at the attitudes and the social behaviors and all that shit based on gender, then or based on biological sex rather, they still have gendered behavior. They still have gendered traits. They still have gender roles. You know, you look at, say, a pride of lions, and the males have very different roles than the females. You look at herds of wild horses, and there's usually one, maybe two males to every dozen females. And those males and females play very different roles.
Monkeys and tigers, they might be male or female, but they aren't men or women.
Stallions or mares? Jacks or jennies? Boars or sows? And my personal favorite, cocks or pullets? Like, Laci, that's special pleading to say that only men and women are genders because they're male and female terms specific to the species. If I told you I gave an apple to a woman this morning, you would be able to tell three things about the recipient of the apple. The first is that she is female, or at least presumably so. The second is that she is an adult. She's fully grown, once again, presumably. And the third is that she is a human. Now, if I told you I gave an apple to a mare this morning, you would also be able to tell three things. The first is that she was presumably female. The second is that she is fully grown, presumably. And the third is that she is a horse. We have gendered terms for different species. And if you say that, well, still only humans have gender because those are still not men or women, well, that's circular reasoning, because man and woman are defined as adult male and female humans. But that doesn't mean that other animals don't have gender. I hope to hear how you can demonstrate that this premise is not special pleading.
Gender is the way that body sex is interpreted and understood in the world, in society.
Well, sure, if you specifically use the term society, because that's a human-only term. We only ever use the term society to refer to the social environments of people. But if you use a more broad term, like, say, social environment itself, one's social environment, well, that would encompass all social species, which in turn would completely blow your entire premise out of the water. It couldn't be that that was for special pleading, could it?
The American Psychological Association defines gender as the attitudes, feelings, and behaviors that a given culture associates with a person's biological sex.
Yes, the APA, who research solely humans and human psychology, use human-centric terms in their definition. If they were studying the gender differences in animals, they would use a more all-encompassing term. For instance, instead of saying peoples, they would say in organisms. If they say a given culture, it would be a given social environment.
And this is the definition that is, widely used by experts.
Yes, experts who study humans. And they study humans in different cultures. So they need a definition that encompasses only humans, but also humans in different cultures.
But when you look at the definition, it's kind of broad and subjective. Attitudes, feelings, behaviors, what does that even mean?
No, they're not subjective. They're just indexed to an individual culture's context. And just because something is indexed to a culture and broadly defined, that doesn't make it subjective. And what it means is how a culture interprets one's biological sex. Just put in basic terms.
And I think that this is one of the problems in this conversation, is that the same word is being used to refer to a million things.
Well, yeah, it's common in the English language, and I'm sure in many other languages, that a single particular term can have several different meanings. I mean, for instance, the term man in English not only refers to adult male humans, but humankind as a whole. So any one word can have multiple meanings. It just has to be used consistently within a conversation, which is the issue we're having and the conversation that you and I are having right now. And it has to be used, in the right context.
Gender sometimes refers to sex. How many genders? Basically 2.
Yes, in fact, I would argue that's the single most common use of the word. But I like how you say basically 2, but in your card you include intersex. Laci, people who are intersex are not some magical third sex. Okay, in order to be a biological sex, you need to reproduce with other sexes aside from yourself. That's what makes a biological sex, and why intersex people are not a third biological sex. I don't want to think that you are including that to kind of be sneaky, sort of like you didn't notice it, but your brain did. I really hope that's not what you're doing. But Laci, intersex is not a sex. It's an anomaly. It's a genetic anomaly. Intersex is a third sex, if you will, in the same way people with Down syndrome are a different species. They're not. They are humans with a genetic anomaly.
Gender sometimes refers to society's gender roles. How many? Basically 2.
No, Laci. Gender has never been used to refer to gender roles. The term gender roles refers to gender roles.
Gender sometimes refers to someone's outward gender expression. How many? Potentially infinite.
No, Laci. Gender has never been used to refer to gender expression. The term gender expression is used to refer to gender expression.
Gender sometimes refers to individual gender identities. How many? Potentially infinite.
No, Laci. Gender has never been used to refer to gender identity. The term gender identity refers to gender identity. And in case anybody in my audience is like, well, clearly she's referring to the language used, because she gives examples, and in her examples she's talking about language used. Well, then why is her next one?
And gender sometimes refers to labels and pronouns. It's language. How many? Again, potentially infinite.
That's right. She brings up gendered language. She does so incorrectly because in language there are only 3 genders: masculine, feminine, and neuter. So the pronouns and the z's and zers are not grammatically correct. But still, yes, language does have gender. I will agree with that.
Okay, so the word gender can mean a lot of things in this conversation. So I think it's good to be specific.
No, you can be as broad as you want, just as long as you're consistent. Consistency is more important than specificity.
Question now is, well, which one of these definitions of gender do we use when we're talking about things like sexism or transphobia, feminism, anti-feminism, gender differences in society?
Well, it depends on those having the conversation. It depends on if they're researchers in the APA or feminists who fancy themselves researchers, which most of them actually aren't. They're more bloggers than anything. And then, lay people like you or me.
Well, this is where the anti-feminist, the radical feminist, and the liberal feminist schools of thought start to have some disagreements.
Well, yeah, they all come from different backgrounds and different cultures, holding different beliefs and using the term in different contexts. Do I have to bring up the Coke thing again?
Let's take a closer look, shall we?
Oh. We shall.
So I asked those of you who feel like there's only two genders to share why. And 53% of you told me there's only two genders because of biology. You know, there's male, female, XY, XX, and it's not a complicated issue. This is fairly straightforward, and so on and so forth.
I will agree with that for the most part, but I'll go ahead and take it a slight step further and say not so much XY and XX, but the presence or absence of a Y chromosome in one's sex karyotype.
Logically, let's walk through this.
Yes, let's walk through this logically, shall we? Now, let's not try to conflate definitions, okay? So when your biology determines your gender, it means that you have an XX and XY, or you possess or lack a Y chromosome. But your gender says nothing else about you or your personality. It's basically just the same thing as your biological sex. Can we agree to that? I'm sure we can. Continue.
In its purest interpretation, gender equals biology implies that all of the differences that we see between men and women in society are ultimately the product of our bodies. We're slaves to our bodies, in a sense, and our social environment doesn't, play a hand in shaping who we are.
Oh.
Yeah, Laci, remember when you said this?
But I need strong arguments. I need arguments that are logically sound, that are not based on emotions.
I guess that standard only applies to those with whom you disagree and not you yourself, because what you just said is an appeal to emotion based on a non sequitur, which in turn is based on the equivocation fallacy. It's an appeal to emotion because the whole slaves to our body and our social environments play no roles in shaping who we are is clearly used to make it seem like, oh, that leaves a bad taste in my mouth, therefore it cannot be correct. The non sequitur part comes from the fact that even if we define gender that way, that doesn't change people's personalities. Like, changing a definition doesn't change who people are, how people experience the world. It's the other way around. And finally, the equivocation part comes in because the way you define gender as biology doesn't make those claims. It's the gender definition used by, like, say, the APA and the feminists and whatnot. Those are the ones where your gender implies who you are as a person and how you express yourself and how you identify. That is not the biological definition. Laci, that is an equivocation.
If biology alone creates the differences between men and women, these differences should be universal throughout the human species, across every culture.
That would only be true if we lived on a planet like Hoth, where the entire climate is just one single solitary environment. But we do not live on a fictional planet in a sci-fi film. We live on Earth. Different environments have different implications on the gender differences. In an environment that's very lush and rich and secure, gender differences have no bearing. Gender roles practically don't exist. Or at the very least, if gender roles do exist, they're essentially equal. But if you live in a harsh environment, then you're going to have very strict gender roles. Now, those gender roles might be different in two different harsh environments based on sort of the logic of the people, but you're still going to have strict gender roles. That's just how it is, because our culture is a function of our survivability within a given environment.
And it would also be constant throughout history.
No, he wouldn't, Laci. Because just as species evolve, so do cultures. You see, like I said, our culture is a function of our survivability and environment. But just as our environment shapes and molds us, so too do we shape and mold our environment. And as that environment changes throughout time, the culture is going to change to stay up to date with it. And it's going to have more leeway. And that's what happens over time. The concept that culture doesn't change over time is just laughable. It's essentially a young Earth creationist argument, and it's not backed by anything we know about evolution.
Because biology, sex is the same all over the world.
Laci, it's logic like that which leads people to believe shit like Arabs and Africans are not human, because if we're all human, then we should all act the same no matter where we are in the world. And you know that's bullshit. So why are you applying it to gender?
But when I look at the world, that's not what I see.
Yeah, it's almost like there's a bunch of different environments because we live on a large planet with many climates. It couldn't possibly be that the differences in our gender could have different implications within those different environments. That would be silly.
How do we account for cultures where the gender roles are completely swapped?
Well, for the Muzuo of China, that comes from the whole rich, lush environment, the secure environment that I mentioned earlier. Because if you look, the roles that men and women play are essentially, equal. One deals with finance, the other deals with politics. Well, those are pretty closely intertwined, so gender roles are essentially nil. Part of it comes from the fact that those people are kind of the biggest kids on the block. Russia has no reason to fuck with them, and none of the other Orientals have the means to fuck with them. And what kind of predators do the Chinese have to deal with on a day-to-day basis to compete with for food? Fucking nobody. So yeah, they're going to have essentially no gender roles. As far as your Papua New Guinea example, my best speculation, I understand this is speculation, but at least it's based on, evolutionary theory, is perhaps the reason why the women are like the community leaders and they're the ones who go out and hunt and fish is because if, say, there's a declaration of war, you don't have to scatter your messengers to the four corners of the island or the fucking area to retrieve all of your men to come and fight. They're essentially Minutemen because they're all right there in the village, ready to pick up their spears and go to war at a drop of a hat. Just a guess.
How do we account for cultures where there are 3, 4, even 5 genders? I mean, I'm not just making this stuff up. It's real and it exists in the world, and so we have to try to make sense of it.
Well, Laci, how do we account for the fact that 2/3 of the world's population accept the divinity and omnipotence of the God of Abraham? 2/3 of the world's population. That's the majority. You get that, right? That's the super majority. And it transcends all these different cultures. 2/3 of the world's population couldn't be wrong. Could they, Laci? I mean, you're an atheist, so how do you account for all of those people accepting the divinity of the God of Abraham?
None of this is to say that biology plays absolutely no role in our behavior either.
Okay, so that line and pretty much the majority of the rest of your video is essentially irrelevant because, once again, it's equivocation. You're equivocating the two definitions of gender and you're like mashing them together. I'm not saying you did that dishonestly either, by the way. I'm sorry if it came across that way. Really, you're dealing with all these different definitions of gender, so the definitions probably just got jumbled up in your head. The same kind of shit happens to me all the time. I'm just a silly pony here, so I can understand that. So pretty much in conclusion, you got a lot of things that I agreed with, and you got a lot of things that I disagreed with. If I didn't respond to something in this video that you said in your video, it's mostly because I agree with it, or it's most likely because I agreed with it, or it's not worthy of a discussion because it's a point of contention that's just so incredibly small that it's probably just a technicality or some shit. So I'm just going to say thank you for opening up the discussion. Thank you for allowing people to talk to you and really reaching out. That's very big of you. I'm one of the people who give you the benefit of the doubt, despite how I may have treated you in this video. But just so you know, watch my Armored Skeptic video and you'll see how I treat the people I like. You're doing pretty good, Laci. But anyway, that's pretty much all I just wanted to talk about as far as that goes. Thank you very much for watching. This has been the longest video I have done to date. So congratulations on that accomplishment. Sincerest regards, Ledger Balance.